The snow fell heavily on the streets of downtown Portland as Sarah Martinez pulled her worn military jacket tighter around her shoulders. The December wind cut through the fabric like ice, but she had learned to ignore the cold years ago. What she couldn't ignore were the stares and whispered comments from the well-dressed shoppers hurrying past her on the sidewalk. "Look at that homeless woman," a teenager muttered to her friend, not bothering to lower her voice. "She's probably on drugs or something." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her weathered hands gripping the small cardboard sign that read, "Veteran, anything helps." She had been sitting outside the grocery store for 3 hours, and the small coffee can beside her held only 2 crumpled dollar bills and some loose change. Christmas Eve shoppers seemed less generous than usual, too focused on their own holiday preparations to notice the woman who had once served their country. The truth was, Sarah wasn't homeless. She had a small apartment about 6 blocks away, barely affordable on her disability payments, but medical bills from her service-related injuries had piled up faster than her income could cover them. Her pride had kept her from this corner for months. But when the electricity company threatened to cut off her power 2 days before Christmas, desperation finally won. A woman in an expensive coat approached the store entrance, her high heels clicking against the wet pavement. She looked down at Sarah with obvious disgust, pulling her designer purse closer to her body, as if poverty might be contagious. "This is exactly what's wrong with this city," the woman said loudly to her companion. "These people choose to live like this instead of getting jobs. It's disgusting." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had learned that defending herself only made things worse. People had already decided what they thought about her situation, and her words wouldn't change their minds. She touched the small patch sewn onto the sleeve of her jacket, a habit she had developed when stress overwhelmed her. The patch was faded now, but the eagle, globe, and anchor were still visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Another group of teenagers walked by, and one of them kicked at her coffee can, sending the few coins scattering across the wet pavement. They laughed as they continued into the store, leaving Sarah to crawl on her hands and knees to collect the money. Her back screamed in protest from the old injury that had ended her military career, but she needed every cent. As she gathered the last quarter, a pair of polished black boots appeared in her line of sight. Sarah looked up slowly, expecting another confrontation, but instead found herself looking into kind brown eyes belonging to a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He was tall and athletic, with the kind of bearing that immediately marked him as military, even in civilian clothes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, extending his hand to help her to her feet. "Are you all right?" Sarah hesitated before accepting his help. His grip was strong but gentle, and when she stood, she noticed his eyes had moved to the patch on her jacket. Something flickered across his face, a recognition that made her straighten her shoulders unconsciously. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from hours in the cold. "I'm fine." The man studied her face for a moment, then looked back at the patch. "Marine?" he asked simply. Sarah nodded, surprised by the respect she heard in his voice. "3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand again, this time for a proper introduction. "Navy SEAL, currently stationed at Coronado." "What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, shaking his hand. Something about his direct manner and the way he looked her in the eye made her feel human again after hours of being treated like she was invisible. Jake glanced at her cardboard sign, then back at her face. "How long have you been out here today?" "About 3 hours," Sarah admitted. "Not having much luck, though. People seem to think I'm just some drug addict looking for an easy handout." The anger that flashed across Jake's face was brief but unmistakable. "Those people don't know what they're talking about," he said firmly. "Mind if I ask what brought you here? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Sarah found herself wanting to trust this stranger, who wore his military bearing like a badge of honor. There was something about him that reminded her of her old squad leader, a quiet authority that made people want to follow him into battle. "Medical bills," she said simply. "Got injured during my 2nd deployment. The VA helps, but it doesn't cover everything. My electricity's getting shut off tomorrow if I don't come up with $200. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. What kind of injury, if you don't mind me asking? Sarah turned slightly, lifting the back of her jacket to show him the long surgical scar visible through her thin shirt. IED blast threw me about 15 feet, damaged 3 vertebrae, and gave me a traumatic brain injury. The TBI is mostly under control now, but the back pain is constant. Jesus, Jake muttered, running a hand through his short hair. I'm sorry you're dealing with that. The military takes everything from us and then acts surprised when we need help putting our lives back together. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like someone understood. The worst part isn't the pain, she said. It's the way people look at me. Like I'm less than human because I'm struggling financially. Those people have no idea what sacrifice looks like, Jake said, his voice hard with anger. They've never had to put their lives on the line for anything bigger than themselves. A group of college students walked past, and one of them made a comment about cleaning up the streets, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Jake's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and Sarah recognized the controlled tension of someone preparing for combat. But instead of confronting them, he turned his attention back to her. Sarah, he said, his voice gentle again. I want you to know that I see you. Not just as someone struggling, but as a fellow service member who deserves respect and support. What you did overseas matters, and what you're going through now doesn't diminish that. Tears threatened to spill from Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned not to show vulnerability in public, where it could be used against her. Thank you, she whispered. I haven't heard that in a long time. Jake reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills, but instead of just dropping them into her coffee can, he pressed them directly into her hand. This should cover your electricity bill, he said quietly. But I want to do more than that. Would you be willing to meet me for coffee tomorrow? I have an idea that might help. Sarah looked down at the money in her hand and gasped. There were $500. More than twice what she needed. I can't accept this, she started to say. But Jake held up his hand. Yes, you can, he said firmly. Consider it one service member helping another. We're supposed to take care of each other, remember? The kindness in his voice broke down the last of Sarah's defenses, and tears began to stream down her face. I don't know what to say, she managed. You don't need to say anything, Jake replied. Just promise me you'll meet me tomorrow. There's a coffee shop called The Daily Grind, about 2 blocks from here. Can you be there at 10 in the morning? Sarah nodded, clutching the money to her chest. I'll be there. Good, Jake said, smiling for the first time since their conversation began. And Sarah? Wear that patch with pride. You earned it. As Jake walked away, Sarah sank back down onto her makeshift seat. Not because she needed to continue asking for money, but because her legs suddenly felt too weak to support her. For the first time in months, she felt hope stirring in her chest. She didn't know what Jake had planned, but something told her that this Christmas Eve encounter was about to change her life. The snow continued to fall around her, but Sarah no longer felt the cold. She looked down at the money in her hands, then up at the patch on her sleeve. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud to wear it. Around her, the holiday shoppers continued their hurried pace, most of them still avoiding eye contact with the woman they assumed was just another homeless person. They had no idea that sitting before them was a decorated Marine who had risked her life for their freedom, or that a chance encounter with a Navy SEAL was about to transform not just her circumstances, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be seen and valued. As the grocery store's lights flickered on in the growing darkness, Sarah carefully folded Jake's money and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Sarah arrived at the Daily Grind 15 minutes early, her hands trembling slightly from nerves rather than cold. She had spent the morning carefully choosing her outfit, settling on her cleanest pair of jeans and a sweater that mostly hid the wear from years of use. The military jacket stayed at home this time, but she had pinned her service medals to her sweater, small reminders of who she used to be. The coffee shop was busy with the post-Christmas crowd. Families still in their holiday clothes, grabbing warm drinks before heading home. Sarah found a corner table and ordered a small coffee, the luxury of being able to pay for it without counting pennies, still feeling surreal. She had paid her electricity bill online that morning, and for the first time in months, she hadn't checked her bank balance 3 times before making a purchase. Jake appeared exactly at 10, dressed in casual clothes but still carrying himself with that unmistakable military bearing. He spotted her immediately and made his way through the crowd, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small bag that smelled like fresh pastries. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I brought you a coffee and some breakfast. You look like you got some sleep." "I did," Sarah admitted, accepting the larger cup gratefully. "First, good night's sleep I've had in weeks. I can't thank you enough for yesterday." Jake waved off her gratitude. "That's not why I asked you here. I meant what I said about having an idea." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I spent last night doing some research, and I found out some things about you, Sarah Martinez." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What kind of things?" "The good kind," Jake said quickly, seeing her alarm. "Did you know that you were recommended for a Bronze Star for your actions during that convoy attack in Helmand Province? The one where you pulled 3 wounded soldiers to safety before the second IED went off?" Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "How could you possibly know about that?" "I have contacts in the military records department," Jake explained. "I also found out that your injury prevented the medal ceremony from happening, and somehow the paperwork got lost in the system. You never received the recognition you earned." The weight of old grief settled on Sarah's chest. "That convoy attack was the day everything changed. I was the team's communications specialist. But when the shooting started, rank didn't matter anymore. We were just Marines trying to survive and protect each other." "Tell me what happened," Jake said gently. "If you're comfortable sharing." Sarah stared into her coffee, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "We were escorting a supply convoy through what was supposed to be a safe route. Intelligence was wrong. The first IED disabled our lead vehicle and killed the driver instantly. Then the shooting started from both sides of the road." Her voice grew quieter as she continued. "Corporal Jenkins was trapped under twisted metal, screaming for help. Private Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to his legs and couldn't move. Sergeant Williams was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. The medic was pinned down by sniper fire 50 yards away." Jake nodded encouragingly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I knew I was supposed to stay with the radio equipment and coordinate with headquarters," Sarah continued. "But I could see those boys bleeding out. So I made a choice. I left my post and ran into the kill zone 3 times to drag them to cover behind our disabled vehicle." "That's when the second IED hit?" Jake asked. Sarah nodded. "I was going back for Sergeant Williams' gear when it exploded about 10 feet from me. Next thing I knew, I was waking up in a field hospital in Germany 3 days later. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive." "What happened to the other Marines?" "They all made it home," Sarah said, and for the first time since starting her story, she smiled. "Jenkins walks with a limp, but he's alive. Rodriguez lost part of his left leg, but he's married now with 2 kids. Williams went back to school and became a teacher. They all send me Christmas cards every year." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "And you think what you did wasn't heroic?" "I was just doing my job," Sarah protested. "Any Marine would have done the same thing." "That's not true, and you know it," Jake said firmly. "Not everyone would have made that choice. Not everyone would have risked their life 3 times to save their fellow Marines. That's courage, Sarah. That's what the Bronze Star is meant to recognize." Sarah felt tears threatening again. "But this time, they weren't from despair. It doesn't matter now. That was 8 years ago. I'm not that person anymore." "Yes, you are," Jake said with conviction. "You're exactly that person. Yesterday, sitting on that sidewalk, you could have gotten angry at those people mocking you. You could have fought back or made a scene. Instead, you maintained your dignity and your composure. That's the same strength that saved those Marines." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Which brings me to why I really wanted to meet with you today. I run a non-profit organization called Brothers in Arms. We help veterans transition back to civilian life by connecting them with employment opportunities, housing assistance, and mental health resources. Sarah's eyes widened as Jake opened the folder and showed her several documents. This is our latest project. We're partnering with major corporations to create mentorship programs specifically for combat veterans. The participants get job training, counseling support, and most importantly, a community of people who understand what they've been through. That sounds amazing, Sarah said, scanning the papers. But I don't understand why you're telling me this. Jake smiled. Because I want you to be our first female program coordinator. The position comes with a full salary, health benefits, and housing assistance. But more than that, it's a chance for you to use your experience to help other veterans who are struggling the way you were yesterday. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Are you serious? You barely know me. I know enough, Jake replied. I know you're a decorated Marine who sacrificed her body for her country. I know you have the strength to survive years of chronic pain and financial hardship without losing your dignity. And I know you have the compassion to help others because that's exactly what you did in Afghanistan. But I don't have any experience with nonprofit work, Sarah protested. I've been struggling just to take care of myself. Experience can be taught, Jake said. Character can't. And besides, who better to help struggling veterans than someone who's walked in their shoes? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what Jake was offering. This seems too good to be true. What's the catch? No catch, Jake assured her. Well, except for one thing. The job requires you to share your story. We've found that when veterans hear about someone who's been where they are and came through it, it gives them hope. Would you be willing to do that? Sarah thought about the shame she had carried for months, the way people looked at her when she was sitting on that corner. Then she thought about other veterans who might be going through the same struggle, feeling the same isolation and despair. If sharing my story could help even one veteran feel less alone, she said slowly, then yes, I'm willing to do that. Jake's smile was radiant. There's something else. I've been in contact with the Marine Corps Personnel Office. They're willing to reprocess your Bronze Star recommendation. The ceremony would be small, but you'd finally receive the recognition you earned. This time Sarah couldn't stop the tears. 8 years of feeling forgotten by the military she had served with such dedication. And now someone was offering to make it right. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Jake said simply. Say you'll take the job and help us build something that matters. Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the families enjoying their post-Christmas morning, oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening at the corner table. 24 hours ago, she had been sitting on a sidewalk, invisible and forgotten. Now someone was offering her the chance to not just rebuild her own life, but to help rebuild the lives of others. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Yes, I'll do it. Jake reached across the table and shook her hand firmly. Welcome to Brothers in Arms, Sarah. I have a feeling you're going to change a lot of lives. As they discussed the details of her new position, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of purpose. She was going to matter again. Her service was going to mean something, and most importantly, her struggle was going to help others find their way out of the darkness. The woman who had been mocked as homeless just 24 hours earlier was about to become a beacon of hope for veterans across the country. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most beautiful transformations begin in the darkest moments, when a stranger's kindness reminds you of who you really are underneath all the pain and struggle. She thought about the patch on her jacket at home, the one Jake had noticed when everyone else just saw a homeless person. That patch represented honor, courage, and sacrifice. Tomorrow, she would wear it with pride again. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood before a crowd of 200 people in the Portland Convention Center, wearing her dress blue uniform for the first time in 8 years. The Bronze Star medal gleamed on her chest, finally where it belonged after nearly a decade of bureaucratic oversight. But today wasn't about looking backward. Today was about the future she was helping to build. When I sat on that sidewalk last Christmas Eve, Sarah said into the microphone, her voice steady and strong, I felt invisible. People walked past me like I wasn't even human. They saw my circumstances and decided they knew everything about me. What they didn't see was 24-year-old Marine who had risked everything to save her fellow soldiers. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. In the front row sat Jake Morrison, wearing his dress uniform and beaming with pride. Beside him sat Corporal Jenkins, Private Rodriguez, and Sergeant Williams, the three Marines whose lives Sarah had saved in Afghanistan. They had flown in from across the country to be here for her speech. The Brothers in Arms program has helped over 300 veterans in the past 6 months, Sarah continued. But more than the job training or housing assistance, what we provide is something every veteran needs. Recognition that their service matters and their struggles are valid. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Many were veterans themselves, some still struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. Others were community leaders, business owners, and civilians who had come to learn how they could better support the men and women who had served their country. I want to tell you about Marcus Williams, Sarah said, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. A photo appeared on the screen behind her showing a young African-American man in army fatigues. Marcus served 3 tours in Iraq as a combat medic. When he came home, he couldn't find work because potential employers were afraid his PTSD made him unreliable. For 2 years, he lived in his car and tried to survive on odd jobs. The next slide showed Marcus in a business suit, standing in front of a medical clinic. Today, Marcus is a certified emergency medical technician at Portland General Hospital. He's married, owns a home, and mentors other veteran students at the community college. The only thing that changed was that someone gave him a chance to prove his worth. Sarah clicked through several more success stories, each one representing a veteran who had found their way back to stability and purpose through the program. With each story, she felt her own transformation becoming more complete. The woman who had once felt worthless was now giving hope to others who felt the same way. The truth is, Sarah said, her voice growing more passionate, we're failing our veterans, not because we don't have resources, but because we don't see them as whole human beings. We reduce them to their problems instead of recognizing their potential. After her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand and share their own stories. A young veteran named Amy approached her with tears in her eyes. I've been living in my friend's basement for 8 months, Amy said quietly. I lost my job because I had a panic attack at work, and now no one will hire me because they think I'm unstable. Your story gives me hope that things can get better. Sarah pulled Amy aside and spent 20 minutes talking with her about the program's services and connecting her with the right resources. As Amy walked away with contact information and a renewed sense of hope, Sarah realized that this was what she had been meant to do all along. Later that evening, Sarah found herself back at the daily grind, sitting at the same table where Jake had offered her the job 6 months earlier. But now, she wasn't alone. The coffee shop had become an unofficial meeting place for Brothers in Arms veterans, and tonight, 5 of them were gathered around the table, planning a community service project. I still can't believe how much has changed, said David, a former Air Force mechanic who now managed the program's automotive training component. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under bridges. Now I'm teaching other veterans skills that can change their lives. The best part is that we're not just helping individuals, added Maria, a Navy veteran who coordinated the program's mental health services. We're changing how the whole community sees veterans. People are starting to understand that we're not broken. We're just dealing with the consequences of serving our country. Jake joined them at the table, carrying his usual coffee and wearing a satisfied smile. I have some news, he announced. The Department of Veterans Affairs just approved funding to expand Brothers in Arms to 5 more cities. Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, Phoenix, and Austin. The table erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah felt a surge of pride at how far their program had come. What had started as Jake's vision and her willingness to share her story was now becoming a national movement. There's something else, Jake continued, looking directly at Sarah. They want you to lead the national expansion. It would mean traveling to each city to set up new programs and training local coordinators. Sarah's heart raced with excitement and nervousness. That's a huge responsibility. You're ready for it, Jake said confidently. You've already proven you can transform individual lives. Now you get to transform entire communities. As the group continued discussing the expansion plans, Sarah's mind wandered to that Christmas Eve 6 months ago. She thought about the teenagers who had kicked her coffee can and the woman in the expensive coat who had called her disgusting. She wondered if they would recognize her now, if they could connect the confident program coordinator with the desperate woman they had dismissed so easily. But more than that, she thought about all the veterans who were still sitting on sidewalks, still feeling invisible and forgotten. The expansion meant she could reach thousands more people who were where she had been, convinced that their best days were behind them. After the meeting ended and the others had gone home, Sarah and Jake walked slowly through the downtown streets. Snow was beginning to fall, just like it had been that first night they met. But now Sarah barely noticed the cold. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Sarah asked as they passed the grocery store where she used to sit. "Every day," Jake replied. "But not because I think I saved you. You saved yourself, Sarah. You had the strength to survive everything you went through. I just reminded you of what you already had inside." They stopped in front of the store, looking at the spot where Sarah's life had changed forever. Now it was just an empty stretch of sidewalk, but Sarah could still remember exactly how it felt to sit there, hoping for enough kindness from strangers to keep her electricity on. "I want to put a plaque here," she said suddenly. "Not about me, but for all the veterans who are still struggling. Something that reminds people that everyone has a story, and everyone deserves respect, regardless of their circumstances." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "What would it say?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the veterans she had met through the program. All the stories of struggle and resilience and transformation. Something like, "Before you judge someone's circumstances, remember that you don't know their story. The person you pass by might be a hero." "I love it," Jake said. "Let's make it happen." As they continued walking, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The Bronze Star ceremony had been deeply meaningful, finally receiving recognition for actions that had defined who she was as a Marine. But the real fulfillment came from the work she was doing now, using her experience to build bridges between struggling veterans and the communities that could support them. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Williams, the former combat medic she had mentioned in her speech. "Saw your presentation online," he wrote. "Just wanted you to know that my unit is planning to volunteer for the next community service project. You've inspired all of us to pay it forward." Sarah smiled as she read the message. This was what true success looked like. Not just transforming individual lives, but creating a ripple effect that spread hope and purpose through entire communities. The woman who had been mocked as homeless had become a national leader in veteran advocacy. The Marine who had felt forgotten by her country was now ensuring that other veterans would never feel the same way. And the person who had once sat invisible on a sidewalk was now impossible to ignore, a powerful voice demanding that America keep its promises to those who had served. As Sarah reached her apartment building, she paused to look up at the lighted windows. Her own window was on the third floor, warm and bright, and paid for with honest work that mattered. In a few weeks, she would move to a larger apartment to accommodate her expanding role. But tonight she wanted to savor this moment of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she prepared for the national expansion. There would be bureaucratic hurdles to overcome, funding obstacles to navigate, and skeptics to convince. But Sarah was no longer the woman who had sat defeated on a sidewalk. She was a decorated Marine, a proven leader, and a beacon of hope for veterans across the country. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single moment of human recognition. Jake Morrison had seen the patches on her jacket when everyone else saw only a problem to be avoided. He had seen the Marine underneath the struggling veteran, and in doing so, he had helped Sarah see herself clearly again. Now, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah Martinez knew exactly who she was